Thank you. Usually I have to tell people that I'm obviously not from around here. I am from North Carolina. I came up here 2 years ago. I am thrilled to be doing this program because I love Charles Dickens. I love A Christmas Carol, and I love Christmas. And you know, a lot of people will say, well, I love Christmas, and Christmas is great and all this. But I will tell you that I have a really legitimate reason. I grew up in Christmas Town. This is McAdenville, North Carolina. And every December, it turned into Christmas Town. All the lights, every tree in town was lit up, every house was lit up. And I know there are places that do that kind of thing now. But I can tell you in the early 70s when I was growing up, towns didn't do that, especially not sleepy little southern meal towns. I thought the town was actually asleep altogether. But you know what? One of the founders of the town wanted to celebrate Christmas, and so every tree is decorated every year. Our town is the topic of a Thomas Kincaid painting. I kid you not. And this is the lake in the middle of town, and this next picture right here, if you look at this light over here to the far right, above that right there, that's the house I grew up in, overlooking that. And so I can tell you that Christmas was a big deal for us, and it was all in the right spirit. The town was encouraged to burn all the lights and light up as many trees and decorations as they wanted to, because for the month of December, McAdenville, the town, paid your power bill. And I would like to point out, when people talk about the commercialism of Christmas and all this stuff, that every business in McAdenville shut down at 5 o'clock before the lights came on. Nobody made money off of doing that. They did it because they wanted to celebrate the holiday. And so I grew up loving Christmas and loving A Christmas Carol. I discovered it early, probably when I was in 7th or 8th grade. I found a big illustrated edition, and we all know, I am sure, of a big illustrated edition of A Christmas Carol. I still look for them. I still read one like that every year. And it's Charles Dickens' most famous thing. Now that's kind of striking. When you think of Charles Dickens, you think of big books. Right? You think of big 800-pagers, Bleak House and David Copperfield. You think of, well, at least 400-pagers, Great Expectations, Hard Times, A Tale of Two Cities. And when you look at that length, there's a reason for that, and I'll talk about it more. But his novels were published in serial form. And you can tell by the length of them what kind of serial they were. The monthly serials are the big fat ones, because it was 32 pages every month for 20 months. That's a big book when you're done with it. The smaller ones that come out about half the length, well, that's a weekly. And they came out about 20 or 30 pages, 20 or 15 pages every 20 weeks. So when those things get put into a book, you end up with 400 pages. And when the big ones, you get 800 pages. Which leaves us with A Christmas Carol, because it doesn't fit into any of that. It's right there in the middle, and it has been said by Dr. Eliot England, you know, we don't read the best of Dickens. We don't read the worst of Dickens. We read the least of Dickens. We read the little 100-page thing. Now, how is it that this writer, and sometimes you'll hear people say that his novels are so long because he got paid by the word. No, he got paid by the installment. So how does a writer famous for big, long novels become most famous for a little 80-page story? Well, that's what I'm here to tell you about tonight, because it's a unique story. It's a story about the traditions of Christmas. It's a story full of ghosts. And it's a story about a writer who desperately, desperately needed money. There's never been anyone quite like Charles Dickens, looking a little whimsical there, I think. No writer has ever had the following he had, or the rise that he had. It is estimated that in his height, in the 1850s, the 1860s, 1 out of every 5 novels written in English being read in the world was a novel by Charles Dickens. No one has had that kind of following before. And it was an extraordinary rise from nobody. He was writing sketches. His first book was called Sketches by Boz. Boz was a nickname that he used, and they were short little descriptive sections that he would put in magazines and newspapers and stuff like that. They wanted a pen name, and so he was famous for these little sketches. And the sketches led to his fame and the skyrocket that takes off his career. This is his first novel, The Pickwick Papers. Now, it didn't start out The Pickwick Papers. It started out when the publishers Chapman and Hale wanted to get someone to write captions for an illustrated book one of their star artists was going to do. His name was Robert Seymour. He was famous for his satiric poems, for satiric pictures and stuff like that. He wanted to do a series of prints called the Nimrod Club, about these four guys who all go out and they go sporting and they have crazy things go wrong and they shoot each other in the arm. And then they go out in boats and they tip the boat over. And it'll be a big funny thing. And he's got funny pictures. I need someone to write captions for the pictures. Chapman and Hale knew about sketches by Boz. He thought, you know, this Boz guy, this is exactly what he does. He does sketches like that. Let's go get him. But they didn't know who he was. All they knew that his name was Boz. So they went all over searching for it. Of course, and the joke is that Chapman and Hale went all over London asking who the Dickens is Boz. Well, they track him down and they approach him and they say, here's what we want you to do. We want you to write captions for this famous series of illustrations. And he says, that's a bad idea. That's not going to make a lot of money. Only rich people can afford a book like that. People want novels. They want a story. Let me tell you a better idea. Publish it as a serial. Let the story and the illustrations work together. Write 32 pages, 3 chapters, give them 2 pictures, sell it for $1. Everybody can afford to get it. People can buy it. They can buy it every time. And Chapman and Hale said, well, okay, so they buy the first one and they buy 3 chapters. Well, what's going to make them buy the next 3 chapters? And the story Dickens told is, well, imagine someone hanging from a cliff at the end of that 3rd chapter. Well, what's going to happen to them? There's a person walking on the top of the cliff. Are they going to help them? Or are they going to kick their feet so that they fall down? What's going to happen? They'll know when they buy the next installment. Our concept of the cliffhanger comes from that. And it's still alive and well every Friday afternoon in soap operas, where something happens almost so that you will tune in the next time. And so Chapman and Hale thought, you know, this kid may be on to something. And so they started doing this. And the logic there too is, well, you know, if the whole thing fails, so what? We'll try it. If it doesn't work, well, it doesn't work, and we'll go back to our idea of the big book. But it did work. Within 10 episodes, sales had skyrocketed to 300 or 400 when it first came out to 40,000 installments, 40,000 copies every month. A huge sales figure, bigger than most magazines and even some newspapers of the time. It was unbelievable. There were Pickwick hats and Pickwick groups. People would read it out loud together. They would share the installments. Suddenly there was a connection between the writer and his audience that had never happened. Think about serial publication. If your story's coming out over the course of 20 months, look at all the things you can do. You can tie in current events. When it comes to a holiday, you can have your characters having that holiday, just like you are. Their lives are moving at the pace of the reader's life. That created a connection between the author and his audience that no one had ever had. And I'm here to tell you, it took off. Next up, Oliver Twist. First novel to ever have a child as its protagonist. Why? Because Dickens began to realize that his method of storytelling allowed him to cover all kinds of classes of people. And he could look at the life of the poor and the middle class. He could bring stories to people that they may never have encountered before. You can bet that a lot of people had not read stories about the lives of a workhouse boy who was an orphan, who was the main character in the story. No one had ever done anything like that. And one of Dickens' friends says, you know, I read an article in the Times about the Yorkshire schools. Do you know about these? The Yorkshire schools would publish these ads in the London Times saying, drop your child off at 2 and come back and pick them up when they're 20. Some people thought that was a little suspicious. Dickens goes up, he tours this, and he writes, he writes Nicholas Nickleby, based on some of those Yorkshire schools. And you know what? There was an investigation of those schools, and a lot of them were closed down. And Dickens said in one of his letters, what a thing it is to have power. I can point out to a wrong and something will be done about it. I can tell a story about something like this, and people will know about it. And his fame and the building up of all of this reaches its absolute top in the old curiosity shop. This is the story of little Nell and her grandfather. Now, the grandfather is a gambler, and he gets in trouble, and a wonderfully Dickensian named character, Mr. Quilp, is out to get him. And so the grandfather and little Nell take an escape from London, and they go out into the country, and the whole readership of the country is caught up in this story of them traveling around, just the two of them trying to survive. And then 2/3 of the way through the story, something happens. Little Nell coughs. Now, if you know your 19th century literature, if a character coughs, things are not going to turn out well further down the road. And so letters start coming into Dickens. Why is little Nell so sick? Surely nothing's going to happen to little Nell. Prayer groups send him in saying, we are praying for little Nell. Surely nothing's going to happen to her. You're not going to let anything happen to this little child. And so Dickens drags it on and on and on. And by the time it reaches its pitch, he's selling 100,000 copies a month of this serial. Everyone wants to read it. The story is that when the boat containing the installments of the last part of Old Curiosity Shop came into the harbor of New York, thousands of people gathered around and yelled to the boat, "Is little Nell dead?" And the people on the boat who had spent the whole trip reading that episode bellowed, "Yes, he killed her." And Charles Dickens would say, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I finished that chapter of little Nell's death with tears in my eyes. And I can tell you that Charles Dickens cried all the way to the bank. No one had that kind of a following. Everyone read Charles Dickens, or had it read to them. They could afford it, and the stories were shared. And so Charles Dickens was his absolute prime. But certainly the story of little Nell and the grandfather was a peak. So he thought he needed a break. So he decides, after the huge success of the Old Curiosity Shop in America, well, I'll go to America and tour. And so he does. He goes to America, and things start out quite well. They're thrilled that he's there. But then, in one of his readings, one of his discussions about what he does, he happened to mention the fact that there was no international copyright. And of course, most of the people who read his books in America got them from bad copies, or from cheap copies, or illegal copies. And so suddenly the headlines that read, "Great author comes to town," turned into "Ingrate author complains about copyright." And so things began to falter, and it didn't go so well. Also, Charles Dickens was a little put off by the degree to which Americans spat. Spitting was a big deal in the 1840s. Every single public place you went into had a big spittoon, the first thing you saw when you walked in. And according to Charles Dickens, most men's accuracy of hitting the spittoon was extremely low. So he thought that was a little disgusting. And for the Americans' part, well, they weren't too happy either. They thought Dickens his hair was too long. He met President Arthur and said, and the president said, he wears too much jewelry. And what is it? With the yellow and purple waistcoats. Because Charles Dickens was a flashy dresser. So he comes back to England. He writes a little book called American Notes, because every British person who went to America and came back wrote a book about it. So he writes that, but he's ready to get into his next novel. That's what I do. And so he jumps into his next novel. And his best friend is John Forster, who will become his great biographer after he died. And he writes forward, he said, this is the best thing I have ever written. The strongest characters. The best story. I'm at the absolute height of my powers. And he's talking about Martin Chuzzlewit. Now, unless you are a devoted Dickensian, Martin Chuzzlewit rings not a bell whatsoever. And it didn't ring much of a bell in 1843. And in fact, I will tell you, because I checked, because about 2 hours ago, I was in your really marvelous bookstore you have here, and they did not have a copy of Martin Chuzzlewit. So if you want to read the book that nobody else was reading in 1843, you'll have to special order it. What is this? Circulation plummeted, 30,000 copies, 20,000 copies, 15,000 copies. No one's reading it. He's in the middle of his new book, and it's a bomb. And not only that, well, he moved into a new house at Devonshire Terrace, so he's got bigger rent. His wife is pregnant with their 5th of 10 children. And all the friends and all the family have already realized, here's the cash cow. Charlie's the cash cow. And everybody's around with a handout. He's in serious financial trouble. And he's stuck with a novel that he has got to continue to write that every day and every month less and less people are reading. So he needs a hit. He needs to do something that will pull him out of this slump and get his name back into people's frame of reference in a positive way. And this brings us to the summer of 1843. And in the summer or fall of 1843, two things happen. Two strands that are going to come together to form the story of A Christmas Carol. Now the first one, Dickens, as I told you before, with the Oliver twist and with Nicholas Nickleby, he was concerned about how the other half lived, as we would put it. And so in the late summer of 1843, he went on a tour of a ragged school, as they were called. He went to the Field Lane Ragged School. These were schools for poor children. Often they were schools where parents would drop off the children while they went and searched for work. The idea was to try to give them a little bit of education and a little bit of food, and I can assure you that they got very little of both. And so Dickens traveled around, he toured this school, and he thought, this is awful. This is awful, and so many people don't know about this kind of thing. I'm going to write about it. I'm going to write an article that will bring people's attention to these kinds of schools. It's just not right that people live like that. And there was a bit of an echo for him too. This is a picture of Field Lane. Field Lane is where Dickens had set Fagin's lair of Oliver Twist. So he knew about the kind of world that was there and the kind of thing these people had to deal with. And they had to live with it. He thought, this was absolutely awful. So he thinks, I'm going to write an article about this. And he's thinking like that when he gets an invitation to come up to the Manchester Athenaeum. Manchester and Birmingham were the big industrial centers beginning to emerge in the mid-1800s. So he goes to the Athenaeum because he's been asked to speak on behalf of education for the poor. Because what the Athenaeum did there in the big industrial town was offer classes. But they were in financial straits as well. So Dickens came there and he gave a speech about the importance of education. And those things begin to percolate in Dickens' mind. The idea of want, of being without, and the idea of ignorance, and how these things are showing up in a society that is getting richer and that is getting bigger. Surely there's a story in that, not an article. And as he was taking the train back from Manchester, he thought, I'm going to tell a story about this, a Christmas story. And he had a framework for that. Back when he began writing Pickwick Papers, he had never written a novel before, and no novel had been written in this kind of installment way before. And so to buy himself some time, he would drop in individual short stories. In other words, he wouldn't have to work on the plot. He would have a character in the plot find an old manuscript. And that let him drop in ghost stories and a famous Christmas story. And so he did a story back during the Pickwick Paper days called The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton. about an old grave digger who is stolen away and shown the error of his ways. And Dickens thinks, that's the thing to do. Some sort of moral tale about an old miser who changes. But he needed a name. Dickens always started with a name. Pickwick had come from an old coach, the writing across the top of an old coach door he had seen and remembered later on. We have a tear sheet where he's working out the name for David Copperfield. And you can see he's got Coppercorn and Copperboy and then Copperfield and then David Copperfield and then scored lines up underneath it. He's got the name. Once he's got the name, he's ready. And then he remembers a trip he had taken 2 years before up to Edinburgh, Scotland in 1841. The two places Dickens loved to go when he came to a new town was the morgue. His favorite place in the world was the Paris morgue, which was a huge tourist attraction because they would get the people who had been found in the Seine River that day and put them on tables in front of the morgue for identification. It was the #1 tourist spot. So he would go to the morgue and he would go to graveyards. He was a graveyard haunter. So he loved to walk around and look at names on graveyards. So he's in Edinburgh in 1841 and he sees this tomb and he walks up and written on it is the name Ebenezer Scrooge. And he thought, Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge. And underneath that was written, mean man. And Dickens thought, oh God, what could you do in your life that they would write mean man on your tombstone? But then he got up a little closer and said, well, no, it didn't say mean man, it said meal man. He was a corn merchant. He dealt with grain, importing and exporting. In fact, Ebenezer Scrooge was an upstanding citizen. But those two things stayed with him. That name and that idea of your name on a tombstone and nothing good for anyone to be able to say about you. And he thought, an old term for a miser was to call him a screw. He's an old screw. And there's an old English word, scrouge, to squeeze or push something down tight. Scrogy, screw, scrouge, Scrooge. Ebenezer Scrooge. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. He's got his character. Ebenezer Scrooge. And so when he gets back to London, he goes to his publishers, Chapman & Hall, and he lays the whole thing out for them. Oh, it's going to be great. I have a great idea, a great Christmas story. And look, we'll do illustrations. I want illustrations in color, and I want the ink in color, and it'll be a huge thing. My name will be big, and we'll all make a lot of money. And Chapman & Hall goes, So you're telling us that even though we are currently making no money off of the novel we are publishing for you, the novel that no one is buying in droves, and you want to do this with color pictures, very expensive. Color ink, very expensive. Colorful boards, he wanted gold trim around the pages. All that is very expensive. And so Chapman & Hall says, well, how much are you going to charge for this? And Dickens says, I insisted it only costs 5 shillings, so everybody can buy it. And Chapman & Hall says, I don't think so. They refuse to do it. It sounds like a financial train wreck, and we want no part of it. And Dickens is furious. He's furious. He knows this is the thing that's going to help him rebound. And so he makes a promise he comes to somewhat regret. He says, okay, I'll pay the printing costs. And he does. Now, what is astonishing about this whole conversation is that it is happening in the middle of October of 1843 about a book he has not written, that he does not have an illustrator for, that he has to write, find the illustrations, get it printed, get it bound, and get it into the bookstores before Christmas. 6 weeks away. And it says everything about Charles Dickens that that's exactly what he did. He got it into the shelves, into the bookstores 3 days before Christmas. 6,000 copies were printed, and they sold out in 2 days. It was a hit. He had done it. There'd be 2 more printings by the end of the year, 13,000 copies before the next year. He had done it, and he was thrilled. He had done it until he saw the printing bill. And so it turns out he didn't quite make quite as much money as he wanted to. But there it is. A Christmas Carol in prose being a ghost story of Christmas. And what I want to do now is talk a little bit about, now of course I could spend hours talking about the book, but what I want to talk about is the ghosts in the book. Because I think this is the most unique thing about it. We think of ghost stories as part of Christmas now. You can buy all kinds of anthologies of collections of ghost stories. But if you check the dates on all of them, they all came after this. This creates the tradition of the ghost story. And look at the way Dickens is going to use these ghosts to move his story along. Now it starts out with tradition. The first person we meet, of course, is Marley's ghost. Well, okay, not that Marley. And you have to let me read this. Hey, Mon, lighten up. It's Christmas. Now, Marley's ghost is traditional. The ghost who comes and tells him that he has lived a bad life, and I am forced to haunt around all the things I have done, and what has happened to me is going to happen to you. Well, that's a traditional ghost story setup, right? And you can get this far into the story and think, well, okay, that's how it is. But things change quickly. Okay, hang on. I'm going to go to the clicker. So just be patient. Yes. All right. The first ghost he meets is the ghost from Christmas past. I want you to think about that. He takes him on a journey back through his life. It's a time travel story. We're 60 years before H.G. Wells and the Time Machine, before any kind of story like that has ever been done. A character is taken back in time to watch themselves have their life. No one had ever tried anything like that. Roger Rosenblatt said that he thinks it's the first ghost that converts Scrooge. The other 2 ghosts, he said, are just power boosters. But it's the trip back into the past that is so unique, to see how you have acted, to see your life laid out for you by someone else, to see how what you did, what you said, looked when you step away. It was a jolt. And it is a story form. It is using the ghost and supernatural powers to show a life in a way that no one had ever really done before. And then we get the Ghost of Christmas Present. And Dickens has a ball with this. This is where you see that Dickens loves Christmas. And he has. All the way back. I told you in Pickwick Papers, he even had an episode where all of the family went to Dingley Dale for Christmas. And I don't know about you, but if you can't have fun in a place called Dingley Dale, there is no hope for you. He loved Christmas, and he loved what was going on in Christmas at that time. And so I'm going to shift a little bit here and talk about 19th century Christmas. Christmas is so big for us. You know, they're starting in October, preparing you for Christmas. But it's important to remember that in the 19th century, Christmas was not such a big deal. It just began to emerge as a holiday, as a matter of fact, when this book comes out in the 1840s. The first collection of Christmas carols came out in 1833. And so it's just kind of the beginning of an interest in this. And there's a couple of factors that came together here. And I want to talk about some of them. The biggest one is this lady right here. This is Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria loved Christmas. And she had a painting made, this is from 1848, from the Daily News, of all of her family gathered around the Christmas tree. This is the first time anyone had really done something like that, to make Christmas tree, the family gathering around it. All of that is new now. It comes a lot from the German ancestry too, because of course Queen Victoria comes from the line of the Hanoverian kings who were German. Now we know the Hanoverian kings because we know George III, right? But George I, now the idea was when Queen Anne died, she had no living heir despite 18 pregnancies. So Parliament's looking for a male Protestant for the throne. And so they reach to Germany for this. They go to the House of Hanover. It comes over. King George I can't speak English. Isn't that great? King of England, and he couldn't speak English. Neither could George II very well. But by the time you get to George III, things are better. But we know about the German love of Christmas even in our own story, don't we? The old tale of Washington crossing the Delaware. He's going back to Trenton. Who's in Trenton? German Hessian soldiers. And what happens? It's Christmas. And George Washington knows how those Germans love Christmas. So he attacks on Christmas Day, where they have no guard and they're all drunk, apparently. So when Queen Victoria marries Prince Albert from Saxe-Coburg, well, then you've got a very Germanic royal family. And with all of that comes Christmas trees and holly and ivy. All the greenery of Christmas begins to come in as part of these German traditions. But there's something else going on too. Let me tell you an extraordinary statistic. In 1761, the British calendar had 46 holidays. By 1833, there's 2. Good Friday and Christmas. And what happened between 61 and 1833? The Industrial Revolution. Factories. And when you've got a bunch of people working in factories, you don't want them to have a whole lot of holidays. Holidays disappear out of the calendar. Christmas gets new emphasis. It's one of the few days of the year where people are off. And think too of the shift triggered by the Industrial Revolution. All the country people coming into the cities. What do they want in the foggy, smoggy cities in the wintertime? They want holly and ivy. They want a Christmas tree. You're the first and second generation of people coming from the country into the cities, and they want to fill the cities with the things of the country. Think how exotic a nativity scene would be if you never saw any of those animals. I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. I never saw any of those animals. A cow, and the cow and the donkey were as fascinating to me as the camel was. But again, think of how those things look set up around the house in these teeming cities, so that the greenery and the country notion of Christmas all come together in a family celebration. Now the German connection, I'll tell you this just because it's just a great little extension to the story. Now the German connection of the royal family was great up until about 1914. Because suddenly, you're at war with Germany. Now, I would remind you that Queen Victoria died in the arms of Kaiser Wilhelm II. That's how close things had been. But by 1914, things are a little rougher. We're at war with Germany in England. And it's a little awkward to be at war with Germany and have the royal house name the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. And so King George V decides, we need something a little more Britishy sounding. And so he comes up with Windsor. And he changes the name of the royal house to the House of Windsor, which sounds more British and not so German to this day, of course. It's the House of Windsor. But that German connection suddenly became a little awkward. But at the time when Queen Victoria married Prince Albert, and I love this, she had to ask him to marry her because no one could say that to the Queen. Only a king could ask a queen in marriage. And so she had to ask him to marry her. But it became the great royal family. Prior to this, there's no polite way to put this, the kings were really just lecherous rakes. Okay? Queen Victoria was 18th in line for the succession because there were no legitimate children. And so a whole new thing begins to happen with the idea of the royal family. And so you start getting pictures like this. The Christmas portrait of the family all arrayed around the tree. That all starts right here. And one of the things that I love about a Christmas carol, sometimes I get irritated when people talk about the commercialization of Christmas. You just hear this all the time. The commercialization of Christmas is all about money and buying and selling. And sometimes a Christmas carol in the DVD form or something will get thrown into this pile. And I like to point out to people, you know what? In a Christmas carol, with the possible exception of the turkey given to the Cratchits at the end, there is no gift given in a Christmas carol. Christmas for Charles Dickens is not gifts. Christmas is family. Christmas is gathering for a meal. Meals are very important in a Christmas carol. Gathering for a meal. And playing games. The Victorians loved games. The Victorians loved any kind of domestic guide. They loved something to tell you how to treat the servants, how to make hasty pudding, how to deal with your husband. They love that kind of stuff. And there's all kind of guides to what to do at Christmas, and they were different kinds of games. My favorite game was called Snapdragon. And I found a picture of it here. For Snapdragon, you take a bowl of water and you pour cherries into it and let them bob. Then you take brandy and pour it over it, and then you light it, and it then you bring all the children around. Oh, this is a children's game. You bring the children around, and they have to snatch in there and try to get the cherries out. And that's what this scene is showing here. And I love the little boy here crying, holding his hand. And one of the guides for these kind of games, too, it says, parents, do not worry about your children being hurt playing Snapdragon. Brandy has a low burning temperature. And there's not too much of a chance of your children getting, and I quote, too scorched. But they loved games. You know, it was a big part of it, getting together like that. What else happens in 1843? The first Christmas card. Sir Henry Cole had a huge, over 1,000 people he had in his correspondence. And he thought, you know, I just don't want to sit down and write all of these people. So he prints on cardstock this, so that he can just write down up underneath it, regards to all, and mail it off. It's the very first Christmas card from 1843, the same year of Charles Dickens' The Christmas Carol. And what I love about it, do you see this right here where the mother is giving the daughter some sort of drink out of a goblet? The 1840s was also the emergence of the Temperance League. And they were extremely upset about this. And so this was a very, very, very controversial card, especially celebrating Christmas, but there's a mother giving the daughter apparently a little bit of Christmas hooch. Oh well. It reminds me of what happened to Santa Claus and his pipe, remember? He used to have a pipe. He doesn't have a pipe anymore. They took the pipe away from him. And so traditions in Christmas, I guess they always change. But some things are here forever. The Christmas tree. An American tradition too. Think of all those pictures of Norman Rockwell. All those families gathered together and trees and decorations. The boy pulling the drawer open that has a Santa Claus suit in it. Think of 'Twas the Night Before Christmas from 1822 by Clement Moore. Hugely popular. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. It became big in the 19th century. It didn't always start that way. I have to tell you that it's an absolute joy to stand in Vermont tonight and tell you that Boston banned Christmas in 1659 through 1681. Those Puritans. Every time I think of the Massachusetts Puritans, I always remember H.L. Mencken's famous comment about Puritans. Mencken defined Puritanism as the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy. Well, the Puritans did eventually recover, and so Christmas has become as big now, of course, in the United States as it is in England too. And it's the same traditions that you can see building up more and more and more. And so every year that we come do that. But I love the fact that Dickens wanted to celebrate this. You know, the great moment when he meets the ghost of Christmas present and all the stuff. And again, no gifts, food. Think about it. All the food about Christmas. But that brings up another point too, doesn't it? About what Charles Dickens wanted to do with this thing to begin with. There's a moment, I'm going to read this to you. There's a moment after they have seen all Christmas is being celebrated where Ebenezer Scrooge is standing with the ghost of Christmas present. And Scrooge notices something scurrying in the feet of the robes. And the ghost pulls his robe apart, and there are these two children. And I'm going to read this because for Dickens, this is the heart of the story. This was everything he was aiming at with this story. The ghost is great and celebrating Christmas is great, but you know what? A lot of people don't have the money or the means to celebrate anything, to have anything during this time. Look here, the ghost says. Look down here. There were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. They were graceful youth, should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshness. There was a stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched them and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade. Through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so terrible, so horrible, and so dread. Spirit, are they yours? Scrooge asked. They are man's, said the spirit. And they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, and this girl is want. Beware them both in all of their degree. But most of all, beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written, which is doom. Have they no refuge, no resource? Cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons? Said the spirit. Are there no workhouses? Now for Dickens, this is the heart of his story. This is what he had seen in the ragged school. And this is what he had seen in the workhouses. And this is what he had seen in the industrialized city that was cranking out product, as Carlyle would put it. This is the story he wants to tell. And sometimes you'll see versions of A Christmas Carol that will not include this scene. If you ever do, you should stand up and hiss. I'm just telling you. So this is crucial to what Dickens wants to do and what he wants his story to be. And then we get this. The ghost of Christmas yet to come, spectre, I fear thee more than any I have seen. You are to show me the things that are about to be. I love this picture. This is like the Stephen King version of the ghost of Christmas yet to come. This next one is one of the original illustrations. John Leach, who was an illustrator for Punch, is who Dickens got to do all the original illustrations, and so he did this. But I love this because, of course, you've got the tombstone with Ebenezer Scrooge, and every time I look at that thing, I think, I know where you got that name. I know where you got that name. But that notion, too, of coming up and seeing where you have gotten in your life and what you have done and what it has led to is a powerful thing. And you have lived it in this story. Not only illustrations, but Charles Dickens, he's good at it by now. He knows how to pull his reader in. He knows how to take you into worlds that are outside your comfort zone. He is going to find a way to tell you a story that you may not have heard before. But you need to know it. This would be a major thing for him. What a thing. What a thing it is to have power. People read my books, and I can make a difference. And he did with A Christmas Carol. It was a huge, huge success. It was immediately made into a stage drama, which was hugely popular all through until today, really, because it worked so well on the stage. And I love it. I've seen a couple of really great productions of it. But Dickens also, this story, after Dickens was finished with it, it didn't make him a lot of money that first time around, but that's the great thing about Christmas. It rolls back around. Later on, he made a lot of money off of A Christmas Carol. He was even involved in some of the productions of doing it because he loved theater. I'll talk about Dickens and theater in a little bit later. But he loved it. But it begins to move into the culture. By the end of the 19th century, you never had to say Scrooge who. It had already moved. It's been said that with the possible exception of Sherlock Holmes, the most recognizable literary figure in world culture is Ebenezer Scrooge. And you can see that in the different ways Scrooge is being used. So I want to show you some political cartoons here. And if you can't see this, what we have here is a man on the left. The top it says the 2009 Dickens Christmas Carol. And we have the businessman here with CEO bonus in a great big bag. And then over here on a little desk we have this Bob Cratchit character. And he's holding something that says foreclosure notice Bob Cratchit. And so in some respects the language for dealing with issues comes straight out of Charles Dickens. 2009, that's a long way from 1843, isn't it? And yet you can look at that parallel being drawn by the CEO with all the money and by the regular employee with little money and see, my gosh, that's still accurate. Look at this one. Here we are. And I would like to point out too that we have both the elephant and the donkey here. I'm being equal. And here, what are they saying? Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Man, what a thing. What did I do? I didn't touch anything. Hang on. Okay, there we go. Okay. But you know, what's great about this is that's immediately recognizable, isn't it? You catch that reference. It's not to say anything about Scrooge. Not to say anything about Christmas. You pick that up. Out of work since 2008 meltdown is what the man's holding. Right? Here's another one. A work group gathered around a table. Underneath it says, our new financial director, Ebenezer, tells me he can start immediately on identifying areas where we can make cuts. Right? Again, the Scrooge being used as a figure that we all recognize. And one more, because these are great. Grinch and Scrooge, underneath it says, you think that's bad? I actually stole Christmas. Now think about that too. I mean, really? How the Grinch Stole Christmas is a retelling of A Christmas Carol. It's the same thing. It's the person who is either burned out or bitter or angry or carrying out whatever kind of dark baggage who just wants to lash out at everything. And of course, you know, again, what's the key moment that happens with the Grinch when the heart grows 3 sizes, right? Because he has what? Because he has seen. Because he has seen. And it has changed his outlook. That's what stories do. Stories pull us into something and we learn something. We lose ourselves in stories, and we find ourselves in stories. And it broadens who we are and what we've seen. That's their power. Okay, so I'm always being asked, well, what's your favorite version of A Christmas Carol? And I will tell you that this kicked off in the beginning. There were 8 productions of A Christmas Carol made between 1910 and 1914. Thomas Edison in 1910 did an early film version of A Christmas Carol. You want a long list? Go to Wikipedia, punch in adaptions of A Christmas Carol, and your jaw will just drop when you see how much has been done, how many different kinds of ways to do this. And again, so I think it's the richness and the power of the story that it keeps being redone and retold. But I will share some favorites with you. This is from 1951. Alistair Sim, this is a very classic version. Sims is in some ways is really truly classic Dickens, you know. Grumpy and mean. The production is really good too. And for a lot of people, I have found too that when it comes to Ebenezer Scrooge, it's sort of like James Bond. You know, the first one you encounter is your favorite. Whoever the first person you see do Scrooge, that's your Scrooge. And I think that's true too. And so for me, the one that I love and recommend is the one with George C. Scott. I love this. First of all, I think it's the creepiest. I think it's the most atmospheric of all of them. It is really, really good. It's very faithful to the book. I will tell you that the scene with the two children is very, very vividly done. And so I recommend this. It's out on DVD too as well. Not that I'm telling you to buy anything, but I'm just saying that it's a great version that I particularly recommend. Also too, I used to host a movie review show, kind of a Siskel and Ebert thing that me and one of the other teachers did on the cable station. And of course, you always do a Christmas show for that kind of thing, and you talk about your Christmas favorites. And so I had to list my 3 favorite Christmas movies, and one of them was this, The Muppet Christmas Carol, which I think is fabulous. It's beautifully done. It's got great songs. And when I mentioned this on my show as one of my recommendations, I got so many emails the next day about people saying, God, I'm so glad you mentioned that. You know, that is really a great one. And I love the way it was done. This was directed by Brian Henson, I think in 1999. And Henson, I saw an interview with Henson when he was making this, and he said something really interesting. He said, well, you know, when my father, Jim Henson, when he did the Muppet Show, you had a Muppet world that humans came into. And then when he did the movies, the Muppet movie and the Great Muppet Caper, you had a human world that the Muppets emerged into as the strangers. And he said, I wanted to create a world where they were completely integrated, that there was no recognition between a Muppet and a human, that there's no difference going on there, to create an integrated world between the two. And he does that in this, and I think it's absolutely marvelous. Also, I adore Michael Caine, and this is just a perfect Michael Caine. And also the songs are great, so you've probably seen it, but I have to tell you, it's a great one. And one more I'll mention too. This is the animated version with Jim Carrey, and I was a little concerned about this. The Carrey tends to take over whatever he's doing, and the last thing, I didn't like what he did with Scrooge, and I wasn't too happy about this. But I will tell you that this is really visually one of the most stunning animated movies I have ever seen. So, and I can tell you too that I think Carrey not being able to use his face, only his voice, changed how he did this. So I do not think it's an example of Carrey kind of getting out of control here. I think his voice is perfect for this because it's just his voice. But I recommend it because visually, I'm a big animated movie person anyway, but I think visually this is one of the most extraordinary things done. Robert Zemeckis, who does a lot of great movies, produced it, and it's just really terrific. But other things I just want to let you know about right quick. The Passion of Scrooge. This is an opera based on it, telling the story through opera. How terrific is that? Book just came out a couple of weeks ago, The Further Adventures of Ebenezer Scrooge by Charlie Lovett. Yeah, and it's just, this just came out. This is all happening right now. The story is still there. And just to show you that nothing, and I mean nothing, is sacred, the Zombie Christmas Carol. Actually, this is terrific if you get a chance to see it, if you're in the comic books. So there's lots of ways to experience a carol, but I want to share with you something Charles Dickens said. Charles Dickens, in one of his letters to one of his friends, said, I will tell you how to experience Christmas Carol. You should listen to it being read out loud in a cold room with only candlelight. And so I want to recommend some audio versions, particularly this one by Patrick Stewart. Patrick Stewart did A Christmas Carol as a one-man show on Broadway and in London. It's a great story too. For me in particular, he's Jean-Luc Picard forever. Okay, but I'm a huge Trekkie. But when he started out doing doing Star Trek, he was a Royal Shakespearean Theatre actor, and he was concerned, he said in an interview, about losing his theater skills. He's like, television is such a different kind of thing. I didn't want to lose touch with my theater background. And his brother was doing a fundraiser at a church in London. And he said, you want to come and do something as part of the fundraiser? And Patrick Stewart said, can I read a little bit of A Christmas Carol? And so they said, sure, that's fine. So he said, I got up and I read about a 20-minute excerpt from A Christmas Carol. And he said, it really hit me. What a powerful story this is. And he said the reaction I got from the audience was unbelievable. And he thought, this is what I want to do. And so he worked out a 2-hour show where he, on stage, does all the characters and does a one-man version of A Christmas Carol. It's available, and so I very highly recommend it. If you haven't heard it, it's just wonderful. Also, Jim Dale. Now, Jim Dale became famous for the reader of the Harry Potter books, and I'm here to tell you that's the way to do Harry Potter. I was working in bookstores when all the Harry Potter books came out, and it was a glorious thing to be doing, to be working in a bookstore when all the Harry Potter books, because you had the midnight releases. I don't think we'll ever have that again about a bound book. We are moving away from bound books. And so I treasure the fact that I was in a bookstore at midnight on Fridays, and there's 500 kids in there clamoring for their books, for their great big giant books. I'll tell you one quick story. I wasn't going to do this, but I'll tell you this one story when I was working for Harry Potter. The next weekend, we had the big release party on Friday night. And so Saturday morning, I'm at the checkout. We're all exhausted because we've been up all night. And this woman bought a copy of the big, volume 5, I think, of Christmas Carol, of Harry Potter. And this man comes up and he says, that Harry Potter book. He said, I was in Baltimore this past weekend, yesterday. And he said, I got up Saturday morning to go for a walk, and I looked, and just kid sitting on the edge of the street with this gigantic book. And I looked down, and there's 2 kids sitting on the porch with this gigantic book. And over there's a kid sitting on a swing set with this gigantic book. And he was like, what kind of crazy neighborhood is this? It's Saturday morning, and all the kids are sitting around reading the Bible. But of course, they were all reading They were all reading Harry Potter. So it was great to be doing that kind of thing. But Jim Dale made his name reading the Harry Potter books. And he does, and I recommend this because this is an unabridged reading. Patrick Stewart's is a tightened up version. And I'll tell you an interesting thing about it. Charles Dickens always wanted to be an actor. And in fact, he had an audition with Drury Lane before he had written a word. And he got sick and couldn't go to his audition. And there are many people who think that he might have become a great actor had it not been for that. But Patrick Stewart said that after he had been doing his one-man show for several years, he actually saw Charles Dickens' script for his reading of A Christmas Carol. And he said that they were almost identical. He was like, the Dickens idea of what would work dramatically was absolutely spot on. And so Dickens reading A Christmas Carol brings me back to our guy. 10 years after the writing of A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens is asked to come and speak at a program in Birmingham. It's December the 27th, and so he thinks, well, I think I'll read from A Christmas Carol. Just like Patrick Stewart really thought, I'll read from A Christmas Carol. It was a huge, huge success. And it starts Dickens on the biggest passion of the last decade of his life, reading his work to thousands of people. Now today, this happens all the time, right? This is part of being a writer, the book tour, where you travel around and you read from your work. It is hard for us to realize that no one did that in the 1850s and 1860s. You didn't travel around really and make a living off of reading from your work unless you were Charles Dickens and you were an extraordinary and powerful reader. His 2 most popular things he read from was A Christmas Carol and the death scene where Sykes kills Nancy and Oliver Twist. He would read this so powerfully that people would faint and pass out. Unbelievable. And you can see that. I want to read you just one of my favorite passages from A Christmas Carol. It is a great example in some respects of how well this works out. This is early in the book. This is where we get the bah humbug. Dickens starts in with the bah humbugs when Fred, his nephew, comes in. Fred comes in and says, "Merry Christmas, Uncle!" And in the greatest opening in literary history. And so Ebenezer Scrooge can say, "Oh, bah humbug." And so they get, "Nephew, why don't you keep Christmas in some kind of way?" And Scrooge says, "Keep it? Why don't you keep it?" "And let me leave it alone then," says Scrooge. "So much may it do you, much good it has ever done you, Christmas." And this is what Fred says, and it's probably the most famous passage from A Christmas Carol, but I want you to hear it. I want you to hear how it works, how it goes across. "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say, returned the nephew. Christmas among the rest. But I am sure that I have always thought of Christmas time when it has come around as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good and will do me good. And I say, God bless it. And you can see how effective that kind of thing could be. When he began reading from A Christmas Carol, he was greatly moved by it. And it's the last thing he ever read from. This is a drawing made of Charles Dickens reading A Christmas Carol in March of 1870. He died 3 months after this picture was made of him. The last thing he read in public was A Christmas Carol. And I think that is exactly right. Christmas Carol is not the least of Dickens. It is a great, great sealing down of the central things that mattered to Dickens as a writer. Broadening your outlook, making you see through the power of stories the way other people lived, putting you for a little while in their lives. Writers do that. Ann Tyler once said, I write because I want to live more than one life. Well, we read for the same reason. We read for the same reason. Now, I want to end with a story of something that happened to me that I want to share with you. This happened about 10 years ago. I was teaching the history of media in high school, history of radio and history of television and history of the internet, because I think it's great to teach students how to read words, but I think they need to be taught how to read images, how to read film, how to read the visual culture that is coming to them as well, and understand it. And so I had 2 schools I was teaching at opposite ends of the county. So in the morning I would teach, and then I had an hour-and-a-half ride to the afternoon. So I had a lot of time on the road, and I was working part-time at the library. And in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA, had a program called The Big Read. And you may remember this. They would pick one book, and they would do it as a radio program, sometimes on NPR as well. But they would do it as they would pick one book, and they would bring in scholars and the author if they were still alive, and they would talk about the book and its influence and stuff like that. Well, you could write to the NEA and get copies of these for your library, and so I had done that. I had written, say, well, send us some of them. And so they sent us this box. And I came into the library one evening, and the librarian handed me this gigantic box and said, well, here's your CDs. Go listen to them, see if they're any good. So that's what I did for this fall. You know, I took these with me, and I would throw one in the car and listen to them. And one of them, actually the first one I put in, was of Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. I've always loved that book. And I've always been struck by the scene in the last part of the book where Montag has escaped from the city and he goes out to this community that is out in the country. And these people are keepers of books by becoming the book. In an era where books are being banned, where they are being burned, each person would choose to become a classic work of literature. And you would become that work. You would be the keeper of it. You would know every word of it. I think that's a marvelous metaphor for reading, because that's what reading is, isn't it? We become the books we love. I'm a little suspicious of official canons, but I believe passionately in personal canons. The books that you have read that have made you who you are. Those are the books that we take in and we keep them. We become those books, and I've always thought that was very powerful. So listen to this documentary, and by the way, you can go to The Big Read online and hear all of these. All the programs are there now online. But when you got to the end of the program, there were bonus tracks. And they were excerpts from the interviews that had not been used in the actual program. And so I'm driving down the road, and the 2 jobs I had were really separated by this long, lonely road through what we called Upper Cleveland County, which was just as dead could get. There's nobody there. So I'm driving around. And we come to the bonus track, and it's an excerpt from Ray Bradbury's interview. And the interviewer asked him, what book would you become? And I slammed on the brakes and stopped right smack in the middle of the road because I thought, oh my God, they're asking him, the man who came up with this concept, with this idea that you become the book you want to preserve, has just been asked what book he would become. And I stopped in the middle of the road. And Ray Bradbury said, I would choose A Christmas Carol. And the interviewer said, why? And I've never forgotten this. I was sitting in the road in the middle of nowhere, nobody around, and I've never forgotten this. Ray Bradbury said, that story inspired my whole writing career. It is everything I've wanted a story to do. He said it's all there. It's a story of death, and it's a story of life, and it's a story of triumph. We weep with that man when he wakes up on that morning and realizes what? It's not too late. It's not too late to be better. It's not too late to change. You may have made mistakes and done things wrong in your life, but it's never too late to become a better person. What greater lesson could literature possibly teach us than that it is never too late to be a better human being? Indeed. And so I am going to end this program the way every program ever done about Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol must end. You must end by quoting Tiny Tim. And so I am going to say thank you for coming out this evening. I hope you have a safe and wonderful Christmas. And I say, God bless you, everyone. Thank you.